Awake, child, daughter, firstborn of our flesh. Feel our silk within your shell, your soul bound to us. You are a holy daughter, a carrier of our light. So rouse yourself to song, little weaver. Prepare the harp and thread, for the land below is near ripe for our snare. Though they live in darkness, in time they shall become a kingdom worthy of our light. Hello, my name is Mary. I'm a writer and professional archivist, and I am piecing together Pharloom's religious timeline. This is video 3 of the series. If you haven't watched the others, I would highly suggest that you go watch them now. They cover the first 3 known eras of Pharloom's religious history, and this video will pick up where it left off. There are some key concepts introduced in it that are needed to get the full experience from this video. As always, despite my professional experience and my sometimes academic approach, I am a person like anyone else. My opinions are not to be taken as irrefutable facts. Lore is vague, and I am taking some liberties in my interpretations, as factual as I'm trying to be. You are free to disagree with my conclusions. In fact, this video is where some of my timeline contradicts my video essay on Hornet. The essay video took 3.5 months to produce due to sickness and other complications. As a result, I knew that I was bound to get some lore wrong, but I chose to post it anyway, as I had worked very hard on it. So let it be an encouragement to you to be okay with messing up, growing, and just having a fun time with lore. In this analysis, my main tools will be the artifacts and architecture around Pharloom. In much the same way I used the strata to date the early eras of Pharloom's history, the architecture helps us map events over the next several eras. However, in this video I will cover 2 eras defined by Conquest. As a result, our artifacts remain limited. In addition, the history of the 5th was purposely rewritten and hidden. As a result, I will also be using artifacts from other eras to help provide provenance and context for the few pieces that still exist. So let us examine the ages of Conquest. Before we discuss Era 4, let's take a quick review of the current state of Pharloom at the end of Era 3. The Snail Shaman had built their chapel in Moss Grotto. The Moss Druids had formed as an order. Nylith had sprouted Shellwood. The Green Prince and his partner were the rulers of Verdania. Faeforn inhabited Mount Fae, and Greymoor was an expanse of vibrant farmlands. I should also mention that since I am focusing more on how the religions and ideologies shape the cultures in Pharloom, I am glossing over certain aspects of the history. While implied in my earlier videos, I wanted to clarify that there were other ordinary bugs who lived in the Mosslands, Marrow, and even where the Citadel would later be built. These were likely the common bugs who make up most of the pilgrims in the present era, but there is no way to know exactly what the old population looked like and how they might have changed over time. There are 3 cultures in this time period that I want to touch on in a bit more detail before discussing the 4th era, and those are the Scar, Stilken, and the Karak. At the end of the 3rd era, the Scar were most likely still separate tribes. Carmelita was alive, but I suspect that it was the events of Era 4 that prompted her to at least begin to form a union with these tribes. I will discuss her actions more in a later part of the video, but I want to adjust a bit of my timeline on the Scar. I said that they had built the Beast Chapel in the later part of the Age of Beasts, but it is hard to say if the temple was the work of one tribe or the unified Scar. So while I still believe their culture was born out of the 2nd era, the chapel might have been built in the 3rd era or even the 4th, though I think the last is highly unlikely. By the end of the 3rd era, the Stilken were in their prime, both as a culture and as warriors. The Stilken as a group share several similarities with the bugs from Sinner's Road, so it is likely that they were related, though the caves that make up Sinner's Road seem to have been farmlands similar to the lower moors. This is jumping ahead a little bit, but I believe that the Pinstresses came from the same group of bugs. They share several biological traits with the two groups and even demonstrate similar battle tactics. The Pinstresses likely joined the Citadel in Era 6 under the Weavers. In a similar way, I trace the origins of the Druids. I think that it is most likely that the early version of their order had formed either at the end of Era 3 or as a result of the events of Era 4. As I will discuss a little later, it is unclear who had access to metals at this time period, but because of the consistent use of the egg fossils in the pillars, tablet, and village of the Stilken, we can assume that they were at least able to carve rock. The weapons of the Stilken warriors likely began with wood, then moved to a combination of shell and rock in Era 3. The Pinstresses sound fairly capable with metal weapons by the time they go to the Citadel, so it is possible that in the late Third Era, the Stilken and Bugs of the Road had a very limited access to metal. The Karak, on the other hand, are a very strange group of bugs. They highly resemble aquatic creatures and crustaceans, yet they all seem to be referred to as bugs. The language in the Hunter's Journal is consistent with the other bugs found across the kingdom. Considering Pharloom's possible prehistoric past as an ocean, it begs the question if they were evolutionary descendants of those creatures or the inventions by an unnamed higher being. I lean more towards the idea that they were created by a higher being, as their lands are drastically different than the areas around them. If this is true, I suspect that their god once lived westward from where the Watcher on the Edge stands. While the area is not named, I believe that what stretches beyond the edge may be what came to be called the Sand Sea Wastes, referenced on one of the Weaver spawn cages in the Cradle. It was obviously once a sea or flowing body of water and likely contributed to the flow of water in the sands of Karak. The gray memento dropped by the Watcher on the Edge appears to be a command for them to stand and watch until life returned to the land. There are a few ways to interpret the message in the Watcher. Either he was sent to guard the land from outward forces until the land recovered, or he was sent to watch for the one who would bring life again. As we will cover in this video, the Karak fell to Silk's Conquest, which makes it strange that they would set a soldier to stand guard at the opposite entrance to their land. Because of this, I think that it is possible that the Watcher is a callback to the Moss Knight who stood at the edge of the Lake of Un, waiting for his god's return. For those who don't know, the Moss Knight has a unique Dreamnail dialogue referencing their wait for Un's return. The Watcher does not mention a god, as do none of the Karak, but perhaps, like Un, the god weakened over time, and the Karak forgot about them. It may even be that the god was a significant source of water or its flow through their lands, and that Karak's negligence and Silk's arrival limited their power. This is obviously speculation on my part, but it is based on storytelling parallels with the first game, and I think it fits the story of the Karak and their dissatisfaction with their own kingdom and the drive to conquer others. Much like the Scar, the Karak had a more prehistoric culture compared to other tribes, focused on primal values exhibited by the beasts. They are also resourceful, using coral, shells, and bones as weapons, and in the case of wildlife, their defensive coverings. However, unlike the Scar, who built upon the dead, the Karak built upon the living. The river that flowed through their lands was a significant part of their culture, as it was vital to their survival and the health and growth of coral. Coral is a type of living creature, and in the real world is a part of the same phylum as jellyfish and sea anemones. The Karak built much of their society around them, training and manipulating their growth into living architecture. The Coral Tower is their most impressive project, and probably one of the greatest architectural feats in Pharloom's history. We see only a fraction of its size outside, implying that it stretched upward to just beneath the depths of Mount Fae. While the lower level appears to have been converted into a tomb, the true throne room rested at the top. A tablet near the entrance reads, "At water's source and coral's heart, our lord born last to rule." It It reminds me a bit of the tablet in the Palace of the Green Princes, but sounds like the real epitaph of a king. However, it seems that the water entered the Coral Lands from more than one direction, and that's only what we can see in 2D. There were other passages of water that we cannot see that contributed to the tower and several other areas. I will discuss it more later, but Mount Fay doesn't seem to have contributed to the flow at all. Thus, I think that the tower wasn't literally positioned at water's source, but likely one of the key points of the river. Water source and Coral's heart are most likely poetic terms for the center of life and power in the kingdom. Of course, Kahn was the last king, meaning that the Karak had several other monarchs in their earlier years. We obviously have no history about how the monarch came to be, but I suspect that the Karak may have chosen their monarch because they could control Coral. The ability to command Coral seems limited to Kahn and a few parts of his army, but it is unclear if that ability is supernatural or military-based. Considering that Coral is a living creature, it may be that the Coral itself recognized the kingship of Kahn and certain military ranks and obeyed accordingly. On the other hand, commanding Coral may also be a supernatural gift imparted to a fraction of the population by a deity. Whether or not the gift was supernatural, I don't think that Kahn and his royal ancestors were the ones to build the Coral structures, at least not entirely. Chakra speaks as though the tribe as a whole knew how to guide the Coral's growth. They most likely formed the structures in the same way you may guide a growing tree or plant into a unique shape. It seems that for many years the Karak lived in peace, satisfied with their territory throughout the entirety of Era 3. Yet something in Kahn desired more. For whatever reason, he believed he and his tribe's strength gave them a right to rule others and set out to conquer Pharloom. The Chapel Maid has this to say about the era. Up top those caves, lost to wind and sand, rests a crusted old ruler, a once great warrior king. In their prime, they and their order held half of Pharloom under hardened claw. Some bugs relished in that strength. Most lived in fear of it. Indeed, it seems that despite Kahn's convictions that strength gave him and his kin the right to rule, most bugs did not believe in his supremacy. However, the fact that some bugs relished in that strength points to the lingering hold of the Age of the Beasts on the minds of the peoples. The truth is that Kahn was a tyrannical supremacist. While battling his memory, the Needlein reveals his cries to his followers. Hone yourself. By strength, overwhelm. Serve and die. Let the weak crumble away. In my name, conquer all. Defy your limits. Besides revealing the brutal intensity with which he commanded and used his own warriors, the dialogue reveals how little he thought of those weaker than him. There is no hint of compassion, just pure desire for conquest. Needlein dialogue outside his corpse and within the Coral Tower only reinforces this idea, saying phrases like, all to bow, and for order brought by claw and blade. It marks a culture ruled by the primal drives of the Age of the Beasts, where the strongest survived and the weakest fell away. Kahn's kingdom began first in the areas where the blasted steppes and sands of Karak resided in the present day. From there, he likely extended east. Due to his people's need for water, he may have conquered the moss regions and what later became of the wormways, and probably the region where the slab exists, as coral can be seen growing there. It is hard to discern their exact territories, but we know that Verdania, Shellwood, Far Fields, and Hunter's March all remained free during the time because they were free to fight Silk later. The Bell Hermit tells Hornet that the Scar originally existed as separate tribes, but united under Carmelita, which is why they were later able to resist Silk as much as they did. It is very possible that Carmelita united the tribes no later than this era, as they would have likely needed the Union to stand against Kahn. The bugs of Greymoor were likely preserved due to their location, as well as the Stilken in their proximity to Verdania. The most important detail of this time is the division it created and how it weakened several groups of bugs and set the other half on defense. Differing languages also point to these divisions. We know that the Karak had their own written language, as did Verdania. The Scar have no written records, but speak an entirely different tongue, which they maintained through later eras. The Snail Shaman maintained their own language as well. Other than these, and the Void Cult tablets in the Abyss, we have no records of the languages of several tribes and lands. This might be the result of Kahn's conquest, as the clearest archaeological records are from the strongest free kingdoms. One place that they at least attempted to conquer was the Marrow, but it is questionable whether or not they succeeded. As one of my astute watchers pointed out, the skull scuttlers appear to use the shell skulls of the Kakri. They aren't exactly the same, but the slight differences could easily be explained by time or cause of death. However, none of the other shells match the other members of the Karak army and look more akin to the beasts found throughout far fields. Considering that Kahn and his warriors dried out due to lack of water, I think that the lower lands were more of a challenge for the Karak to conquer. The presence of the Kakri skulls may suggest that they sent out scouts or a small military force to survey the area, but they didn't make it very far. If the Karak did manage to take the Marrow, it probably took a toll on their numbers and strength, and likely would have been the first areas they would abandon when Silk attacked. The final details I wish to cover of this era are the technologies available. In most cultures, the weapons and architecture used bones, coral, and/or stones. This is a sign that the metalwork of the forge homes, but not the deep docks, did not yet exist or was in its rudimentary stages. Since Kahn ruled so much of Pharloom, it would have made sense for him to have access to some metals. But besides an iron gate or two in Verdania, there is no evidence that any of the old kingdoms could produce any substantial metalwork. Verdania also appears to have metal lamps, at least from the sound they make when they fall. Not all their lamps appear to be made of metal, however. For example, in the palace, they seem to sound a little bit more like stone. However, both styles of lamps do use glass and contain glint flies. Glint flies are fireflies and are different from silk flies. You can see this in Hornet's house as her desk lamp uses a silk fly, but her string of lights uses the same tiny glowing bugs as Verdania's lamps. The Karak also appear to have used glint flies in their lights. Curiously enough, the Scar in the time when you beat Carmelita use silk flies in their lamps as they do in the present day. If her memory is accurate, it reveals that silk flies are a native bug to Pharloom, not an invention of the weavers. However, these ones are not likely the souls of other bugs. So Pharloom ended its fourth age divided. On one side ruled a ruthless tyrant. On the other, fierce, independent tribes strong enough to hold their own against him. Armed with stone, bone, and claw, the stage was set for the era that followed. For far from the void, in the highest reaches of Pharloom arrived a true pale being no mortal could slay. And as the kingdoms below battled unknowingly, she began to birth her own army. The origin of Grandmother Silk is one of the greatest mysteries of Pharloom. She appears out of nowhere, descending upon the land and conquering it with total and impressive power. While not the first pale being in Pharloom, she appears to be the one with the most success. She began her reign in the upper strata of the land, not far from the tunnels leading to the surface. Whether she spontaneously came into being or traveled to Pharloom along the surface from a distant land, her choice to build her kingdom at the highest heights does not appear to be accidental. The first strategy of the location is that it put as great a distance as possible from her and her most ancient enemy, the Void. Another advantage of this location was access to senseless Pharlids, which she evolved into weavers. They were made to serve simultaneously as her daughters and the first converts to her religion. Sapient bugs would have required convincing or the rewriting of their minds, but the Pharlids could be shaped and manipulated into the most perfect of followers. There is no knowing how long Silk spent creating and training the weavers, but it does not appear that she attracted anyone's attention until she began her conquest of the land. Besides the element of surprise, the position seems to have allowed her some control over Pharloom's water supply. If we look at the black pillars of the ancient culture, we can see that they make up bridge-like structure in the putrefied ducts, as well as the blasted steps. We know that water once ran through that area, flowing into western Pharloom. The ducts flowed eastward into what became bile-water. When we consider that both of these bridge structures exist on either side of the cavern that houses the Citadel, it is very reasonable to assume that the water ran from the surface downward into the cavern, where it then flowed into other areas. While some water trickled down from other areas, such as above Mount Fae, the architecture and environments indicate that a main shaft of water originated where the Citadel now stands. While in a previous blog post, I had hypothesized that Silk might have used the Weavers as a military force in a part of her conquest, the more I examined character testimonies, the more I noticed the lack of reference to the Weavers. Thus, I believe that Silk carried out the majority of her conquest solo from her position in the cradle. She did this through two means. First, her pale sway, the natural ability for pale beings to draw the worship of weaker-minded bugs. Second was through the wielding of Silk. When Silk is captured by the Void at the end of Act 2, she weaves herself a cocoon and shoots the Silk all the way from the Void Sea through stone, magma, metal, and shell, from deep within the Void Sea to the foundations of the cradle. Here is a map to show you how far she can extend her Silk. Mind you, at this point she has just woken up from an eras-long enchanted slumber, being beaten up by Hornet and had her arm hacked off, and is currently being eaten alive by Void. Imagine her power when she first appeared. If we use her range in Act 3 as reference, Silk could have easily reached all of the lands below as well as beyond to conquer them. Although the weave nests were built after her slumber, they confirm this range, as most sit just outside the range of her Silk. The only exception is the weave nest on Mount Fae, which is internally named Weave Nest Askar. I assume that the Weavers only dared to build it close because Faithorn, another higher being, ruled the area. Perhaps she disrupted their mother's silken sight in some way. Visualizing this range gives us a pretty fair assessment of where she could have conquered. While she could not haunt bugs, she could easily cause them terror, weaving snares, or collapsing passages and reshaping the land, all while she was safe in her palace. Remember, in Act 3, the reason she is a threat to Pharloom is because she is clinging onto the upper strata to prevent being pulled deeper. Between her strength as a pale being and the might of the Void, the two are starting to pull the land apart. She would have certainly had this strength during her conquest, so we need to keep in mind that she had the physical strength as well as the power of soul at her disposal. While I believe that Silk most likely conquered Pharloom in a combination of Silk and her pale sway, I do think that the Weavers likely served as civil servants and enforcers of her rule. The Weavers appear to have been readily accepted as deities after their mother fell asleep, which makes it likely that the bugs of Pharloom were already familiar with them. The ability to leave the cradle and wander the land would have also given the Weavers the opportunity to plot their initial rebellion in areas where their mother could not sense their ill intentions. There is one possible piece of evidence that they might have served as a military force, and that is found in Chakra's conversation with Hornet about Widow. After hearing Hornet describe Widow's condition, she says, "Even broken, my envy remains. A weaver's fabled skills. To meet one in combat meets great challenge, great pride and victory." The Weaver's skills were known to the bugs of Pharloom because of their reign in Era 6, where they ruled as deities after their mother's slumber. Chakra's tribe is also fixated on combat. Thus, this may be Chakra simply wishing to battle a god with incredible powers. However, the comments could also be interpreted that the Weavers had a reputation as magical warriors, meaning that the Weavers, such as the First Sinner, served as members of their mother's army and helped to subdue what she could not overcome with her sway and Silk. There seems to have been very little conquest that happened under the Weavers, if any at all, making it unlikely that this reputation could have come after their mother fell asleep. Even if Chakra's comments have nothing to do with the Weavers who served as Silk's warriors, the first children did play a vital role in their mother's conquest, as we shall discuss later. From the accounts of the snail shaman in several Needle-in memories, we know that the Scar, the Karak, and Shellwood were the peoples and lands that stood longest against the Pale Monarch. The Scar rallied around Carmelita, whose song allowed them to stand longer than others. Verdania also held on for a time, but it too was conquered. Faithorn and Nylith likely occupied their lands with little disruption, as Faithorn shows little malice towards Silk. Although she aids Hornet in the end, the Maskmaker seems surprised, speaking as if Faithorn has remained a neutral party. The state of Nylith and Faithorn during Silk's reign might have been comparable to Un and Greenpath under the rule of the White Worm. The last to stand against the Pale Light were the Karak. They survived by union and sheer show of force. It is likely that their hold of half the land is what gave them the military strength to be the last ones to fall to Silk's rule. However, Silk's control of water meant that she could direct it east and drain the coral lands. I do not think that Faithorn contributed to the drying out of the coral regions. While a bulk of the water in the blasted seps came from where the Citadel now stands, the coral tower is set too high to receive water from the central shaft. Kahn's memory of the coral tower features water flowing down from above, which looks like it may have come from Mount Fae. However, Faithorn seems to have been the reason the Weavers built their nest on the mountain in Era 6, and it seems unlikely that Faithorn would have arrived in Era 5 when she would conflict with Silk. If she had arrived in Era 4, she would have come into conflict with Kahn's Conquest, and there is simply no evidence of it. Thus, it is most likely that she long predated the drying up of the Karak, meaning the primary source of water and its blockage came from elsewhere. This seems to indicate that Faithorn retained her control over the water that poured over her region even after Silk arrived. Similarly, in modern times when the water has been corrupted by the Citadel's filth, Nylith's lands still have clear water, which is what drips down to water the mosslands below. So although the two higher beings were inferior to Silk's power, they had enough control to maintain the environments of their kingdoms. Before I go any further into this era, I want to cover the evidence that confirms that Silk conquered Pharloom. There are some who believe that it was the Weavers who conquered the land, so I thought I would share why I assigned the conquest of Pharloom to Silk. The first is that Kahn says in a Silk memory that he and his people were the last to stand against the Pale Light. In Hollow Nest, both the Radiants and the Pale King were referred to as lights by the seer. It seems to be a very common term for pale beings. The Weavers, on the other hand, are usually called Weavers, Spiders, First Children, or by terms that describe their traits. Grindel calls them Horrid Crawling Whisperers. The Surface Bug calls them the Weaving Ones. While the Weaver's artifacts are called pale, they themselves are never referred to by their light or paleness. Thus, I believe that this is a direct reference to Grandmother Silk. Of Verdania, Hornet tells the Snail Shaman that it was destroyed by the Pale Monarch and the system used to keep her caged. While some could argue that Grandmother Silk destroyed Verdania through the haunting, we have to remember that the prince's partner went to the Citadel to try to keep his lands from being destroyed, implying that they were in danger at a point previous to the haunting. In addition, the conductors made it a point to attempt to preserve Verdania through the Memoriam, once again implying that it was near its end. This is a bit of a spoiler for my timeline, but the haunting takes place in Era 9. The Cogwork Dancers and the Memoriam were made in Era 7. This combined blame for Verdania's fall comes out in conversations with the Green Prince. When he meets Hornet in the Citadel, he speaks of the city's bugs as being drawn up and strung, in love with the great golden leech atop their lands. While it could be a reference to Silk, I think it is more likely a reference to the Citadel itself, metaphorically comparing the devotion of the Citadel with the haunting caused by Silk. It would also make sense for him to call the Citadel a leech, because its pollution surely would have influenced his homeland, as would their various other actions, from casting his partner as an automaton to taking wildlife to create the Memoria. While in the prince's throne room, Hornet tells the prince, "You are mortal bugs caught beneath a being pale. Devotion or destruction, these are the only fates my kind allow." Note that the Green Prince does not disagree with her. Rather, he snaps back at her for attempting to console him. Paired with the other information we can gather, this frames their story as they were offered a chance to serve and worship Silk and refused, and thus were conquered for it. This fits Hornet's description of Verdania's fall being a combination of Silk and the Citadel. Silk's conquest is best understood as a territorial claim of Verdania, while the Citadel brought the land's ultimate downfall. Carmelita is the only one of the old hearts who could possibly be from a later era. As mentioned earlier, the Scar use silk flies in their architecture, both in the present and in her memory. It is also said that her song kept the Scar from following the monarch's will, which could be interpreted as the haunting. However, like Kahn and the Green Prince, Carmelita knows that she is battling a pale being. She calls Silk the creature pale. Furthermore, when Hornet comes to collect her heart, she says, "Great One, I come not to see you as you are. Rather, I would have you recall what you were before the pale monarch, when once your heart beat bright and brave." If before the pale monarch meant before the haunting, it would place Carmelita in eras 6 through 8, when the Citadel was at its strongest and it was most capable of suppressing the Scar. However, when Hornet plays her needle in, we can see that the Scar have threads in them, implying that they took part in the Citadel's system. Thus, it is most likely that Carmelita, like the others, stood against the pale monarch herself before her slumber. I checked to see if any of the Scar and Carmelita's memory respond to the needle in, and none of them do. In contrast, Carmelita is still singing in the era when Hornet arrives, but the only ones who can clearly hear her are the mottled Scar. They don't appear to have participated in the Citadel's religion, as they are silkless when Hornet plays the needle in. The silk-bound Scar sing that they are trying to hear their queen's song, but they are confused as to what is her song and what is not. Even though the Ant Queen's present power is mortal and fated, it is obvious that she could have saved more of the Scar if they did not have silk in their shells. These details seem to confirm that Carmelita's memory is set before Silk and the Citadel conquered Pharloom. She is at her absolute strongest, and the Scar are untainted by Silk, placing her origins in the Third Era. I believe her size in the present day also confirms this dating, as she was far smaller and younger in her memory. Like many of the other beasts in far fields, Carmelita continued to grow across several eras, surpassing the size of other large bugs found in the Citadel. Lastly, I thought I would address a commenter who said that Silk was interested in affection, not in conquering Pharloom. While it is certainly true that she is fixated on building a family and being a mother, she is still a pale being with a desire to dominate and be worshipped. This is clearest to see in Silk's thoughts when Hornet defeats the Unraveled. She says, "Bind their shells, bind their souls, bind them all, raise them up to devote eternal. Their voices, their song, their memory, one mind, one union, they are ours, bound forever." To me, this shows an obsession with possessing the affections of more than just her family. While having a family was her ultimate goal, it was not her only one, and thus I believe the reason why she sought to conquer the rest of Pharloom. Although the Weavers wiped the knowledge of Silk from the land after they lulled her to sleep, we can piece together select details about her reign. The Citadel, under the Weavers and Conductors, functions as a government known as a theocracy. In a theocracy, the state is ruled by a god or gods. It may also be ruled by priests, claiming authority from God and acting as an intermediary between the people and God. Silk, however, is called the Pale Monarch. This hints that she ruled under what was called a theocratic monarchy. A theocratic monarchy is a government overseen by a single ruler who has authority over both the civil and spiritual aspects of their kingdom. In the real world, many pharaohs of ancient Egypt ruled as theocratic monarchs. In the world of Hollow Knight, Hollow Knight's government under the Pale Worm was a theocratic monarchy. This is why he was simultaneously working on developmental projects such as tramways while being worshipped by his subjects through pale idols. I suspect that Silk's theocratic monarchy was a little more on the theocratic side than Hollow Knight's. Her love of worship through music, her desire for unity, plus her calling daughters divine, all point to her desiring reverence as a god overruling as a queen. But there is yet more we can learn about her rule, for where the weavers have silenced her voice, the architecture speaks. If we take some time to peruse the cradle, we will spot several contradicting features. Many of the ceilings and platforms are supported by beams built in the style of the weavers. The loom and portions of its platforms have light gilding. Even fancier gilding lines the floors and the platforms of the central room, the room with the cages, and what became the lower prayer room in the later eras of the Citadel. The collapsed room with the harp also features the weaver-style supports, but the floor is not gilded. Rather, it appears to be covered by some black material that differs from the raw stone of the cavern. But even more curious are the many large pipes which block access to the upper throne room, though they appear attached in places as a sort of ventilation system. In the present day, the pipes have been broken in several places so as to allow the bugs to traverse the gilded floors once again. This is the result of several modifications over multiple eras. But to better understand what we are looking at, we need to jump forward to an artifact from the next era. Hidden at the very edge of the Whispering Vaults, in what is the very eastern edge of the Citadel's foundation, we find Pious Ismore, a bronze statue of a pilgrim that comes to life when Hornet interacts with it. He is one of two matching statues that bookend the pilgrim's journey. The other statue is in Bone Bottom, whom I call Pilgrim Ismore. Pilgrim Ismore is in rags and carries an offering plate, but Pious Ismore is dressed in the garb of the choir. He is heavily tarnished in part due to age, but also from his proximity to the toxins of bile water. Pious Ismore stood just outside the White Ward in the Coral Chambers and preached sermons to new pilgrims. His platform still exists in the background in the center of the room. Time has eaten most of his words, but we can piece together what he says. Corrected, his sermon begins, "Pilgrim, cast aside those many sinful hopes for rest and reward. Remain pure within our midst. Ask for nothing. See the Citadel's simple stone, bare and unadorned. See how plain our garb, how sparse our meal. Know that excess is sin." This is incredibly important because it tells us that the gilded walls of the present Citadel came well after the time of Silk and the Weavers. However, Pious Ismore is himself proof that metalwork had at least begun during the rule of the Weavers, as he speaks of the Weavers bequeathing Pharloom to pilgrims in present tense, meaning that they were alive when he was cast. Ismore also reveals that the Citadel was first made of plain stone. This plain stone is still visible in the modern Citadel, in the underworks, and you can also spot small sections of it behind the ventrica in the Grand Bellway. But there is an even earlier testimony we can reference to understand the cradle's original form. In the memory we receive from Widow, the floor of the room where the weavers are playing their harps matches the flooring we see in the weavers' dens. It is not the same flooring found in the room with the stashed harps, though it also fits the weavers' aesthetic. Because of the way the light shines down on the weavers in the memory, it is most likely that they were in the central room of the cradle with Silk dwelling above them, and what we are seeing was the original flooring before it was replaced by the current gilding. By using this memory, Pious Ismore, and other details I will discuss, I concluded that the Citadel was built up in 4 phases over 4 eras. In this video, I am only going to focus on what we see in the cradle, but I will cover how I dated other architectural elements of the Citadel throughout the series. Between the harp memory and the collapsed room, it seems that the cradle originally looked similar to a weave nest. This is very interesting, as the weavers maintained this aesthetic even after their mother was asleep. We don't know if the design was divinely inspired or an invention of the weavers for their mother, but the architectural style defined the cradle, which was all that existed of the Citadel in Era 5. This is where Silk would have ruled from, and, due to the lack of weaver architecture in the rest of the Citadel, was most likely the limit of her palace. I will cover the construction of the Citadel in far more detail in the next video, But for now, here is how the cradle changed after Era 5. The weavers built the loom of the cradle at the beginning of Era 6, once their mother was asleep. It was sometime after the creation of the loom, probably closer to the middle years of the weaver's reign, when they removed the old flooring and added the gilded floors. The pipes were added in Era 7, under the conductors. These additions also include the terminus, which is a pretty good time capsule of what the Citadel looked like, at least during a portion of Era 7. The map dispenser is also from that era, as the model inside features a citadel covered in massive dark pipes. It was put there for workers who were sent to clean and mend the citadel's pipes, which functioned both as ventilation and as passages for the terminus. You can see some of the large vents in the far background of the cradle. And yes, they made their workers purchase maps so they could do their job. Is that surprising? The Citadel was not touched again until the haunting in Era 9, when Silk used haunted bugs to reopen the cradle's old passages. This timeline works with the Maskmaker's testimony that the Citadel was built as a system to keep Silk sealed in slumber. While the harp memory confirms that the cradle did predate the creation of the Citadel, it was later modified by the weavers to match the aesthetics and religion of the Citadel of Song. It may be a bit surprising, but it took me a bit of time to settle on the date of the loom's creation. This is because I don't think that the weavers wove Silk's cocoon. I will get into that a little later, but first let me explain why I date the loom at the beginning of the 6th era. First, the loom features very thin gold gilding. It is worn in places where the silk is pulled, and is in no way as fancy as the flooring found throughout the area. It seems that gold and most precious metals in Pharloom came from the mines of the Forge Bugs, the tribe from which the Forge Daughter and Deep Dock workers originate. The Deep Docks were an outpost of the Citadel, but we know that the Forge Bugs existed before it and lived in an area of Pharloom that we never see. The Forge Daughter speaks of being called to work in the Deep Docks from the Forge Homes, meaning that the tribe still exists in the present day. Because they appear to be the source of most precious metals, crafts metal and steel appear to be more naturally reoccurring elsewhere, it means that Silk probably conquered the Forge Homes in Era 5. Due to the thin nature of the gilding, it seems that it was applied with more rudimentary tools, and not with the finesse of the skilled Forge Bugs. As a result, we can presume it was probably applied by the weavers. This dates the loom as coming in late Era 5 after Silk's conquest or early Era 6 after the weavers put her to sleep. Were it made in Era 5, it would have been used to help weave Silk's cocoon and then reversed in Era 6 to harvest silk. Were it made in Era 6, it would have only been used to harvest silk for use in the Citadel. When I look at the loom, I can't help but notice that it doesn't seem to function well as a means to weave the cocoon. In fact, from the way it is strung, it seems to be drawing silk away from the cocoon. The bladed platforms, which are too sharp to function as combs or other parts of the loom, appear to be used to cut silk before bundling it onto the golden spools scattered across the floor of the cradle. These details are what convinced me that the loom was built solely for the purpose of harvesting silk, and thus was built at the very beginning of Era 6. While we don't have a clear record of Silk's reign, I tend to lean on the side that she didn't rule very long after completing her conquest. I think that the weavers waited for her to conquer the land so they wouldn't have to, and shortly afterwards seized the kingdom from her with a melodic mutiny. And this is where most of our physical evidence of the history of Era 5 ends. The weavers quite successfully hid the truth about their mother, making it difficult to determine how events unfolded. I could spend forever talking about every possible version of events, so instead I'm going to tell you what I believe happened in Era 5. This is not a comprehensive overview, nor do I believe that I am correct about all events, but I want to offer one interpretation of history based on the limited details we are given. First, even before the weavers evolved, I believe that Silk lived in a cocoon. I base this on the memory of the first sinner. In the vision, a distinct shaft of light shines on the weaver. Unlike a flashlight that sends a beam down when it is turned on, this light appears to be shining through a hole. Silk at first glows faintly before her light increases in intensity. It is unclear if the shaft spreads because she emerges from the cocoon or closed space, or if it is simply an animation to end the scene, representing how the weaver remembered being overcome by Silk's pale light. We see Silk's light behave the same way in the memory we receive from Widow. This appears consistent with the powers of the pale beings, whose light appears to glow rather than be wielded in a shaft like the Radiance. The physics of the lights in these scenes also fits the theory that she was in a cocoon. Does that mean she was always in the cocoon? I'm not sure. However, if she could create openings, it would follow that she could enter and exit at any time she wished. In the last dive, she seems to have left an entrance in the cocoon for Hornet. A similar hole would create a light like the one in the memories. However, I believe that she spent most of her days wrapped in its safety, being present but also somewhat distant from her daughters. The Pale King acted rather similarly with the same subjects he worked so hard to impress, as Lem says that he remained elusive to them. Even the White Lady wove herself a cocoon so she could be isolated in her exile. So this sort of behavior isn't completely unusual for a pale being, even with a drive for dominance and affection. When I first considered it a possibility that Silk could live in the cocoon, I began to think of why she might have lived this way, and I think that the answer lies in the end of the game. When Grandmother Silk is captured by the Void, what is the first thing she does? She weaves herself a defensive cocoon. But since the silk is a manifestation of her soul, she is gradually disintegrating as the Void eats it from the outside. Consider this. A pale being descends upon a land filled with brutal warriors. They treat creatures perceived as pale with certain hostility, yet Silk desires their worship. What does she do? Go down and battle herself? While great in size with marvelous magic, her resources are finite to a degree. If she expels too much soul too quickly, it will take time to replenish. Not to mention, her size would make it difficult to navigate the land in full. So she makes an army who can produce silk like her. Besides providing the worship she desires as a pale being, they can also lend her silk for her conquest and protection, and even move about in the lands below in her stead, if need be. Silk herself calls her children weavers, so it would make sense that she made them with the intention to weave silk, not just play harps. I believe this is why Silk wants Hornet. She seems to be trying to reconstruct her old family with whatever weavers she can find. Widow is replacing her old musicians, which is why Silk had her staked. She doesn't need her silk free to play music. Hornet, on the other hand, she wants for her ability to produce silk. I don't think that this is to make up for a lack of silk, but an act of pride. Why expend her own silk when she can use someone else's, especially after being enslaved for the same purpose for several years? It's not like we haven't seen any other pale beings use their children for their own selfish ends. And that includes you, lady. You deserve a lot more blame than you get. But it isn't just the world of Hollow Knight that provides precedent for Silk's behaviors. We can find it in real-life spiders as well. Many spiders use webs to hunt, but have a place to retreat to when they sleep or feel threatened. This can either be a part of their environment or something they make. There is a genus of spiders called sack spiders who weave themselves shelters beneath and between leaves and ground litter. Beyond this genus, you can find other spiders who also weave themselves silk shelters. One such spider is the furrow orb weaver, who specifically weaves a cocoon in which she resides as she mates and lays her eggs. By the way, orb weaver is the title of a family of spiders who weave circular webs. I thought this was incredibly interesting, especially because Silk's identity is rooted in her desire to be a mother. So staying within a cocoon could be a way of her preserving and symbolizing her identity as the mother of mothers. Another similarity between real-world spiders and the weavers is the existence of communal webs. Orb-weaving spiders sometimes connect their webs to create huge shared structures. Similarly, the weavers appear to have woven several other webs in the cradle, as we see in the harp memory. They probably connected to the cocoon, and was a means by which they could ascend to and descend from their mother. This reveals another aspect of the Weaver's rebellion. In order to build the loom, they removed the communal webs, literally severing ties with their mother. The only silken connections left were the strands drawn down into the loom, marking a new relationship dictated by power and enslavement. So Grandmother Silk evolved the Farlids into weavers, had them build her a palace in the cradle, play her music, and aid in some degree in the conquest of Pharloom. At some point, the weavers grew tired of serving their mother, and, once the land was conquered, made a move to conquer her. So how did the weavers overcome their mother? We know that they used music, as it is the reason they built the Citadel of Song, to maintain the melody to keep their mother asleep. But why music? Was it simply a calming melody, or something more? And more importantly, why are there so many bells used in the Citadel's religion? I think that the answer lies in Hollow Knight, specifically in Godhome. The God-Seeker is a collective consciousness of several bugs who seek to amplify the resonance of a god whom they can worship. In various conversations with her, we learn that every being has a resonance or sound, and that the greater and more powerful the being, the greater their resonance. This is why in the upper parts of Godhome you can hear what sounds like the hum of a tuning fork as the God-Seeker seeks to attune the mightiest god in their purest form. But if you listen, in the midst of the tuning hum, you can sometimes catch the smallest tingle of bells. I believe that the weavers figured out how to use the bells and music to create a resonance that worked the opposite of the God-Seeker. Rather than amplify a god, the weavers attempted to reduce their mother's resonance, effectively rendering her helpless to their song and will. Another place this shows up is the tuning fork atop Mount Fae that the weavers used to call Faeforn. It also makes me wonder if the reason Faeforn gave them trouble is because they were attempting to influence her using resonance. As a side note, I have no idea if it was purposeful on Team Cherry's part, but the heads of the judges match the shape of the god tuner. That shape also appears on several of the metal railings found around Greymoor. The judges are not related to the God-Seeker, as far as I can tell, and I don't think that they are functioning as god tuners. However, the similarities in symbolism is something that struck me since my earliest playthroughs, and I think a way that Team Cherry is hinting as to how the Citadel is functioning behind the scenes. To me, the weavers manipulating resonance makes the most sense, and also explains why the song needed to be sustained constantly. If the resonance wasn't actively countering their mother, she risked waking. Most likely, this meant that for a time, the weavers would have needed to keep up the music themselves, until they invented some form of the Citadel of Song. Once again, there is also a real-life aspect to this theory. Due to their weak eyesight, orb-weaving spiders use vibrations in order to navigate the world and sense what is happening in their web. Perhaps this is why Silk demanded the harp music. It was a way of her daughters not only worshipping, but communicating with her. While pale beings appear to have some degree of natural world sense, the idea that Silk also relied on vibrations to see the world could explain why a counter-resonance was so effective against her. Because Silk was in the Cocoon, the weavers had no access to her physical body. If they had, a slumbering god without the ability to wield Silk or bind her wounds would have been very easy to harm. We know that pale beings aren't immune to physical injuries in age, as evidenced by the White Lady's blindness and perhaps the Pale King. Thus, if their mother was not in the Cocoon, I believe that the weavers could have killed her. While the resonance put Silk to sleep, it did not make her unconscious. As discussed earlier, the weavers built their dens at the very edges of Pharloom to hide from her sight. While in later ages the resonance changed, allowing their mother to wield Silk again, in the early days it seemed to restrain most of her powers except for her world sense and her innate ability to reproduce soul. But before I go further, I want to look at a testimony of what happened to Silk to better explain what happened next. Let's examine Pharloom's folly, the verse we read at the opening of the game. They see your beauty so frail and fine. They see your peace, woven of faith and toil. They forget your heart, bound in slumber and servitude. When you wake, they shall see your truth, a beast's nature, bare to all. I will talk more about the song in a later video, but I want to point out the third line. It says that Silk was bound in slumber and servitude. The cocoon wasn't what kept her bound. It is made of Silk, her own soul, and she is a pale being, capable of a greater focus than any of her children. In later eras, Silk has no problem controlling Soul and shooting it from the cradle down into Mossholm. The only way the cocoon can function as any sort of cage is if she is bound by slumber. Without the counter-resonance keeping her weak, the sphere of Silk is not a cage, but an arsenal of soul at a god's disposal. The second concept in the third line of Pharloom's folly is that Silk was bound in servitude. Silk's servitude was her being used as a source of silk to construct the Citadel and keep it running in their absence. This is the reason for the empty spools in the bottom of the cradle. They were originally used to bring silk to the bugs below. The only way I believe this could have worked is if the cocoon was woven using Silk's hair. We see this in the Abyss when we fight Lost Lace, but also when she first wakes. She breaks out of the cocoon, but her head appears caught in its weavings. Or perhaps she's just stretching after a 4 eras long nap. The cocoon certainly wasn't made of weaver silk. They would be the ones in servitude, contradicting the verse in Pharloom's folly. In addition, why would they hide their mother in silk, then unravel it and risk exposing her? It makes no sense. But if the cocoon was woven with her hair, it would gradually replenish, allowing for multiple harvests without exposing their mother. Of course, the counter-argument to this is why didn't they just harvest her hair without ceasing and drain her entirely like Hornet does in the Weaver Queen ending? Because the Weaver spires exist and know that Hornet can absorb them, it seems that the Weavers had knowledge that they could bind other beings with silk. You could say that they were mortals and weren't capable, but there were quite a number of them. I think that they could not kill her, because even in sleep, she actively fought their influence. Another sign of her still present strength is the lack of runes on the cocoon, or even it seems on her own body. We do see a sort of seal over the memory orb in the Silkheart visions, but they are also on the other Weaver memory orbs, making it less likely to be a restraining seal and more related to preservation. In Weaveness Atla, we find the silk shades of the Weavers making the snare setter to bind their mother. The fact that they are pursuing weapons and tools that use runes, while the cocoon is untouched, seems to confirm that they could not use runes on her. In fact, most of their tools appear to be built for a physical confrontation, something that doesn't seem to have happened. This, once again, makes me believe that the cocoon was spun and maintained by Silk, and that whenever they tried to unravel the cocoon to reach her, she kept it replenished, protecting herself from their weapons and schemes. In the end, I believe the Weavers built the loom and used the strands from the cocoon to secure it within the gilded arch. If we observe the current state of the cocoon, it quickly becomes apparent that the bands attaching it to the wall do not keep it suspended in the air. The bulk of the bands sag downward, rather than holding the cocoon taut. 2 ceiling supports have fallen, and while we can assume that there are probably other support bands behind and in front of the cocoon that we cannot see, it is still not enough to hold up the silken sphere. There is also no way something of that size and bulk would hang by a collection of sagging threads and not be pulled lopsided by the many taut strands drawn down into the loom. This leads me to believe that the cocoon is naturally suspended in the air by Grandmother Silk, and that the bands are merely anchors to keep it in place, probably applied by the weavers so they could pull strands into the loom and harvest silk. The lower bands, including the one on the arch, are great examples of this, as they offer no physical support to lift the cocoon, but would prevent it from shifting horizontally. In the Citadel's doctrine, we hear the cocoon being referred to as a heart, and we can see its pulsing rhythm stop when Silk wakes. If the cocoon naturally floated on its own while also shaking the chamber with its deep pulse, it would explain one reason why the weavers would have attached it to the walls. In almost every way, the weavers reversed the cradle and their mother's rule from a place of slavery into sovereignty. Music went from being a burden to a prison for their mother. Rather than the weavers being a source of silk for their mother, she became their source. Even the symbol of the arch in the cocoon, built into the very framework of the cradle, was an inverting of their servitude. In the harp memory, the silhouettes of the weavers bent over their harp are a mirrored image of the cocoon in the arch. Lastly, the cocoon went from being a place of safety and defense into a shrouded prison that not only hid her from adoration, but made her vulnerable to the wishes of others. So the 5th era came to a quiet end, and the weavers began their reign armed with their mother's kingdom. Unlike their mother's rule, they left a clear mark on Pharloom. But to piece it together, we need to look at the story of a figure who provides us with the foundations we need to understand all that follows. The first sinner is found locked behind an area of the slab marked by the apostate key, and can be accessed through a room unlockable by the heretic key. A heretic is one who believes something contrary to a religious doctrine, and an apostate is one who renounces a religion or political belief or principle. Both of these describe the first sinner, who believed that the weavers were not the actual divine children of silk, but magically evolved Pharlids. Her needle-in dialogue reveals that she considered both her and the weavers cursed by silk, cursed with silk. When Hornet finally binds her and sees her memory, she says, "She called us daughters. She called us divine. She lied." Notice how she says, "she lied," referring to silk, not "we" or "they lied." If she were imprisoned by other weavers and had been angry against how they lied to the common bugs about their divinity, I imagine she would have mentioned them. Instead, all of her dialogue reveals pure anger against silk. She also says, "I did not wane, I did not forget," while fighting Hornet. This to me sounds like her rebellion was in the time of silk, not against the weavers. If she did not wane or forget about where they came from, why would she have stood back and allowed the other weavers to establish a religion based around a lie? Maybe it's because she didn't know it was a lie either, at least, not initially. The first sinner also claims she was cursed to know. This reveals that she was privy to certain knowledge that not all other weavers knew. It is possible that the weavers rebelled against silk simply because they wanted to be out from her rule. While relishing in that new freedom, the first sinner somehow discovered the truth of their birth. When she brought it up to others, they did not believe her or feared rebellion of the lesser bugs and the loss of their lavish lifestyle. So they labeled her a heretic and locked her away, making her the first sinner of their new religion. This interpretation has several details supporting it. The first is that it follows a theme within the game, which I will discuss in a future video. The second detail is the style of the platform beneath the first sinner's prison. If Silk's palace originally featured Weaver-style architecture that the Weavers gilded, it makes the cell more likely to be a construction of the Weavers. The cell also shares similarities to the other metalwork of the era, such as the sign of the Blasted Steps and Nihilith's Shrine, to name a few. In addition, I personally think that the first sinner's prison is more gilded and fancy than the cradle. Although it is not gold, the abundance of fine metalwork makes me think that the cell was made with some respect for her, despite her rebellion. Another interesting detail is the language on the metal seal of the prison. It is the earliest artifact to feature the musical text of the Citadel. From its widespread use in the 6th era, it is likely that the weavers used it first amongst themselves while serving silk, and later imposed it on the other bugs of Pharloom. I suspect that this was part of Silk's push for complete religious and social reform after she successfully defeated Kahn, setting herself up as queen. But it is the text of the seal that can help us place when the first sinner rebelled. The inscription says, "Penitent, first of the first, guilty of the sin of apostasy, penance by constriction, absolution, denied. First of the first refers to the first children of silk, one of the names of the weavers. The first sinner is the first weaver silk made, which is confirmed by Needle-In dialogue and her title in the game's files. The fact that this is mentioned means that this was some sort of ranking or count among the weavers as to the order in which they were created. A similar format is used for the common bugs condemned to the slab. If we wander through the prison, we can find several choral commands with prisoners' sentences. Each command begins with their identity, a number, their sin, punishment, then whether or not they were absolved. Because the prisoners were not weavers, but those under their rule, we know the numbers no longer referred to the birth order. It makes the most sense to interpret the numbers as the prisoner's place within the choir and what generation of choir they were a part of. The other option is that the number refers to the generation of pilgrim who entered the city. One choral command reads, Penitent, 12th of the first, guilty of an unnamed sin, penance by casting, absolution not granted. If the numbering is the choir in the position, this prisoner was in the very first choir that sang in the Citadel. Whatever he did must have upset the weavers because he was executed by being cast in metal. That's right, Pius Isamore was likely one of the earliest sinners. In a great act of irony, his mold was used with silk flies to guide pilgrims in obedience from the start of their journey in Bone Bottom to the arrival of the Citadel. Because we know that someone in the very first choir was imprisoned in the slab, this immediately places the first sinner earlier than the first choir. In fact, knowing that something as small as singing off-key is considered a crime, I think that the first sinner never even saw the choir or manifestation of the grueling system the weavers invented. This explains why she doesn't express any anger towards the weavers. If she was the only one who truly understood their origins, she couldn't live normally alongside them. She was cursed to know. The others, then, were simply naive and oblivious, wrapped up in a false identity their mother had invented. For that reason, the first sinner would blame Silk for the deception of her sisters and direct all her rage towards her mother. I will go more into the reign of the weavers in my next video, and how the first sinner, Pius Isamore, and other figures help us to form a greater cohesive timeline of their rule. For as much as Silk's era is shrouded in mystery, the weavers leave us a bright, shimmering trail for us to follow, from the Mosslands to the stark heights of the Citadel of Song. Thank you for watching another video on Pharloom's religious history. The 6th era is one of the longest eras, so I'm going to take 2 more videos to cover it. If you are interested in hearing more about the Weaver's reign, consider subscribing. In the meantime, be sure to like this video if you liked it and share it with other Hollow Knight fans. Is there anything about this history that surprised you? Anything you disagree with? Comment with your theories, especially about Silk and the Cocoon, and feel free to make responses or commentary. Thanks again for visiting the Aether Vivarium.